Okay. So, welcome, Andrea. I thank you for your time. And
Thank you.
first of all, I need to introduce yourself. So, before, I would like to say your titles, and then you could say something personal, maybe. Okay?
Okay.
So, you're a PhD in linguistics and literary studies, right? For at USP, and also partially in Manitoba. Am I right?
Yes. That was the what we call the sandwich. I
Okay.
did 6 months of research in the University of Manitoba.
Oh, that's very interesting. We can also talk about that later.
Hmm.
And you have been a professor at UFMG in Brazil since 2002?
Right.
Okay.
Long time.
Yeah, that's great. And what do you teach there?
I teach mainly applied linguistics, and most of my job is focused on preparing teachers to become English language teachers, or
Okay.
what we call in English TESOL, which means TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other languages.
Okay, that's very interesting. But for starters, what is applied linguistics? Because most people tend to think that linguistics is all about syntax, phonetics. Is
Yes,
applied
they are
linguistics
right.
this?
They are
What's the
right. That's
difference?
what linguistics is about. So, linguistics is, let's say, a discipline that is mainly focused on the intricacies of languages and specific languages for like English linguistics, Portuguese linguistics, German linguistics, whatever. So specific researchers research these aspects of specific languages. Okay, so some people focus on the phonology of a certain language, the syntax of a certain language, the semantics, the pragmatics. So this is morphology also. So I would say that linguistics studies these all these levels of language, starting in, let's say, the smallest divisible parts of the language, which is phonology, and maybe morphology at the same time. Then you go on to syntax and semantics, pragmatics, and wider parts of language referring to text. But applied linguistics is started as a discipline focused on how to teach language to other people, to students in general, right? It started exactly in how to teach English to non-native speakers of the language. But then it spread to other languages and also to like in Brazil, Portuguese as a native language. Okay, in the U.S., Canada, and English-speaking countries, applied linguistics nowadays is um, also has, let's say, a share on how to teach the native language to their own speakers at school, right? So, applied linguistics, in terms of teaching the native language, is very much focused on reading and writing. Because, of course, these students, when they get to school, they already know how to speak the language and understand it, right? Applied linguistics in teaching the native language will focus on how to teach reading and writing. Now, in other languages, it involves what we call the four skills: reading, speaking, listening, and writing. So, if you teach English or any other foreign language to students that don't speak this language, who are let's say non-native speakers, of which is also terminology that is very much controversial, but for now let's stick to it. So these non-native speakers of the language, they need to understand the language, they need to speak the language, they need to read and write the language.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the four basic skills that we call. There are what we call micro skills, which would be exactly grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. So these micro skills also need to be taught. But so this is how applied linguistics is started, and there is also a controversy on what nowadays we really call applied linguistics, and the difference between applied linguistics and linguistics applied. So
Mm.
linguistics applied would be getting these theories developed in the area of linguistics and applying it, or applying these theories, or applying this knowledge to teaching any language, native language or foreign languages, right? Um, but what we now call applied linguistics, and not linguistics applied, is a broad area, very much interdisciplinary, that works with several aspects of language in a specific society, or in a specific community. So how language is really used in these communities or societies, and what aspects of these societies interfere with language use. So we are much more worried about issues of affect, for example.
Mm-hmm.
How does emotion help or hinder language learning? Um, Race, class, gender, these are issues that very much interfere with language use and learning in any society. So these broader issues, social issues, are the main focus of of applied linguistics
Mm-hmm.
nowadays, I'd say. Okay.
Oh, I thank you for your awesome explanation. But I would like to go back to specifically your work in teacher education, because we are understanding now, because of your explanation, that applied linguistics is far beyond than only grammar, pronunciation, and the four skills. So, what would you say is your job as a teacher educator? Would you say that you teach language teachers how to teach language, or would you like to add something to your job as a teacher educator?
Yeah, that's a hard question. Yeah, well, I mean, not only me, but everybody that works with language teaching or teacher education, specifically in UFMG, the university that I'm part of, we do teach language to language teachers, and we do teach them how to teach language, but we take a different perspective. So when I learned English, for example, when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, when I started learning English, the way I learned is completely different from the way I prepare my students to teach nowadays. So I used to learn from a very traditional uh, perspective, let's say, through memorization. So the basic focus was to memorize language rules and and vocabulary, and and then put these rules together to form a sentence, for example, and then put the sentences together to form a paragraph. Put the paragraphs together and form a full text.
Mm-hmm.
This is not how we teach language now. Although yes, there are several places where we still find teachers teaching in traditional ways, but that's not what we want nowadays. That's not what our students need anymore, because they can find that in on the internet, right? So we have to do more for our students.
Mhm.
Uh, so nowadays we do the opposite. We start from the text, and even the context that where that text is part of, or where it was published, where it was found. So where does that specific text come from in the social use of that text or other texts? What is the purpose of a specific text? Why is it important to learn the language that is used in that text, that specific text? It may be a written text or an oral text. As I said, it doesn't matter. Language is a whole. Okay, it's part of a social use. So, what are these social uses that we make use of in using the language? Okay,
Mhm.
so we start from this idea of a broader text or context, and we teach the language that is in this text. So instead of, for example, teaching our students the present perfect or the verb to be, uh, verb to be is I am, you are, he, she, it is. So instead of teaching that and asking our students to memorize the paradigm of the verb to be, for example, in the present simple, we select a text that may be easy enough for a basic student to understand. The text may have like images, graphics, or pictures that will help the students understand the meaning of the text, the content of the text. And in this text, we will select basic structures, basic vocabulary to focus on. So students will not study the language, the rules of the language as separate units, but already inserted in a text that circulates in our society normally. That's what we call authentic language. So language that was not prepared to teach language, to teach English in this case, but language that was developed or created in normal uses of the society.
Mhm.
Okay, so for authentic use. So we select texts that are already circulating in these communities, in our communities, and use them to teach the language to these students. Basically, I não sei, acho que eu esqueci, me perdi aí no meio. Qual era a pergunta mesmo?
That's okay. The
Yeah.
question was, what is your role as a teacher educator? And
Oh, okay.
I think you answered because
Yeah, all right. If you
you
think it's so, basically, what we do is we teach our teachers to come to their in let's say
pre-service.
pre-service teachers. We teach them how to teach language using these authentic
Mhm.
materials, or so more communicative uses of the language, instead of these grammatical traditional memorization ways of learning the language, which is also possible. I learned English that way,
Mhm.
but it's much more difficult. It takes a long time, and it's completely detached from normal uses of the language in societies.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. So, you in your talk, you also said that you learned English at the age of 8 years old, right? In this very traditional way.
No, no, I
No?
started.
Oh,
I
yeah,
didn't say
you
I
started.
learned. I
Okay.
started. That's a big
Okay,
difference.
I agree. I understand. But another thing that I consider to be very different from my context, the Brazilian context, and here, the Europe or in the Netherlands, is that in Brazil, we tend to learn English later on in life, like around 10 years or even more for different people. And another thing I notice is that here the use of English within society is very higher than in Brazil. Like when you go to a supermarket, you can use English, but still,
So you never learn the local language.
yeah, that's a discussion I'm noticing here. But still, I see a lot of people here who say that, for example, children should never learn English with their parents at home. They should learn with natives. So, considering applied linguistics, do you have something to talk about it? About language acquisition through non-natives?
Yeah, well, so this idea of native and non-native speakers of the language, as I have already said, is a very controversial terminology and controversial concepts, in fact. Because nowadays, due mainly to globalization, but also to other aspects of our, let's say, Western society, English is so much used all around, at least these what we call Western
Mm-hmm.
society, that nobody can claim ownness of the language anymore. So, yeah, who are these that are considered native speakers of the language? And why are they so important if most of the times we are not using English or any other language with their specific native speakers, so to speak? Okay, so why is it so important, or why was it so important to have a high level of competence in English? When I mean English, I mean any other language. I'm speaking about English because that's my focus.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I work specifically with English. You know that.
That's okay.
So, if I have problems in my pronunciation, I can still be understood either by a native speaker or a non-native speaker. So, what we would establish as the specific level that you would be called um, advanced speaker of the language or basic speaker, that is not so important anymore, because people, and this is something else that is important to talk about. When we think of these Western societies, we here in the so-called West part of the globe, we are very monolingual.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go to other areas of the world that are not so monolingual, like India, China, and what do you call those areas? Malaysia, Philippines. What is that? Asia, or
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
my
okay.
my geography is terrible, but there is a specific name for that area. Anyway, so there, specifically in these islands of Asian islands, the movement of peoples around these places is so enormous that they change to learn other people's languages, and they mix up several languages. So if you take Alistair Pennycook, for example, that is an Australian researcher, he talks about this proximity of these languages around islands in Asia, and people living in different places in different times of their lives. So they live in Japan for a while, they learn a little bit of Japanese, then they move to the Philippines, they learn something else in one of those islands, some local languages. Then they go to Greece, for example, they learn a little bit of Greece, or and they come from let's say they come from the US. So they mix up all these languages when they talk to other people. If they don't know, if they're talking to people who can speak Japanese, for example, they speak a little bit of Japanese, and then there is a word or two that they don't know, so they say that word in English. The Japanese speaker doesn't understand, but then there is this strategy: let it go. We
Mm-hmm.
let it go for a while, and then as the conversation goes on, this is a strategy described by Kanagaraja, which is who is a researcher in multilingualism and world Englishes. So he talks about these strategies that if you don't understand when we are talking to somebody, you let it go for a while, and then as the conversation goes, you understand what
Yeah.
your counter speaker is was trying to say. So nowadays it doesn't really matter who is native,
Mm-hmm.
who is not, because you know so much about several languages that you can speak to any
Mm-hmm.
person. And even if you are speaking to a native speaker, or if you are a teacher, when I was preparing to become a language teacher, there was very much this idea of being native like.
Yes.
This in fact hinders learning, because we become so um, anxious, and you see the influence of affect in language learning.
Mm-hmm.
We become so afraid of making mistakes, so anxious about producing language perfectly, that we can't really learn. We become like stuck in a certain level, because we are afraid of testing our hypothesis on language speaking, right? On language in general. So um, we don't nowadays, we tend to disregard this idea of being native like, because really the native speaker has let's say has lost importance in using language.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter. Of course, we need a certain standard. We need certain models, but who is going to be the model? Are we going to follow an American model, which in the sense, when I say American model, this is also very controversial.
Yeah.
I'm speaking about the US. So where exactly in the US
And
is this
who?
model coming from, right? Is it a New York model? Is it you know South Carolina? Is it
Mm-hmm.
Arizona? It doesn't really matter. If you follow any model, it will always be different from other models. So models have also lost importance in applied linguistics. Okay, so we teach the basics. And we also teach how language is very much influenced by social issues,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the focus. We also want to teach critical values
Mm-hmm.
that are important in language learning, but also in society as a whole, like learning how language transmits
Mm-hmm.
ideologies, transmits values.
That's
And
actually my next question. What does
oh, okay.
critical in language teacher education means to you? Because I know your work focuses on critical language teacher education, right?
Critical language teaching, and because of critical language
Mm-hmm.
teaching, I also focus on critical language teacher education. So this idea of being critical comes from power, right? So
Mm-hmm.
everything that is critical is related to power. Language is a tool for transmission and establishing power relations in our society. So it's important for our students and our teachers to understand how language deals with power issues in our society, how language is this tool. I mean tool, because it is exactly what it is. It's a tool for power exertion in our society. So, learning how language works may also help you find ways to go around these power issues.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so basically, this is the idea of critical language teaching, learning how to um, become more empowered through language,
Mm-hmm.
okay? Making your points, using the correct um, voice, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And also learning values through language, right?
I
Basically, that.
understand. Thank you. So now I would like to give a concrete example for those who are interested on what can be your research when you're in applied linguistics. And I know your work focused on post memory, right?
Right. Yeah, well, this is one of the areas that applied linguistics is now focusing on, the big area of affect, as I was saying in the beginning. And memory is, let's say, one. So, affect would be this umbrella area where you find emotions, risk taking, fear, anxiety, and also memory. There are other aspects. That I can't remember, or
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't mention all of them anyway. But memory is part of this big area called affect. I've written a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm trying to work with is how trauma also affects language and language use in society. And post memory is this idea of the memory of a second generation or a third generation, a generation that has not experienced the trauma, the historical trauma in that society, but that has learned from their parents and grandparents, so their previous generations, narratives and stories about these traumatic events. The big example is the Second World War and the Nazi regime in Germany, and how the Jews were, not only the Jews but other populations as well, like gypsies, but the Jews were the biggest, yeah, the most of
Most of the
the
people
people
affected.
affected by this persecution, right? During the Second World War. So these Jews who were either died or who were put into jail, specifically in concentration camps and death camps like Auschwitz. They suffered a lot, and many of them died in these situations, but some survived. And then when the World War ended, they were able to tell these stories and what they really suffered during these many years of the Second World War and even before it.
A great
Uh,
example is in Frank, right?
Annie Frank, right? She is very famous for her diary, right?
Mm-hmm.
And where she tells the story of how she and her family and other Jews were able to hide during the Second World War, and how they finally, well, the diary stops there when they were there.
They were
Um,
caught.
they were caught, yes. So this is post memory. And what is the importance of post memory for our society? That's exactly trying to avoid this traumatic experience to be repeated. So
Mm-hmm.
in Brazil, for example, here we were not very much affected by the Second World War,
Mm-hmm.
although Brazil did send soldiers to fight in Europe. But except for from those families that were, the
Mhm.
families related to the soldiers. The society itself was not very affected, but we were affected by the dictatorship. We had more than 20 years of dictatorship in our country. And about 50 years later, we were almost involved in a second wave of a dictatorship
Mhm.
because we forgot.
Yeah.
We simply forgot what happened during the dictatorship. So there were people doing demonstrations on the streets asking for the return of the military government. This is absurd.
Yeah.
This is unthinkable, right?
Yes, I would like to talk a little bit about the dictatorship. I think most people here don't really know a lot about Brazilian history. And I know that the dictatorship was very much expressed through arts in Brazil, right? So I believe that we have a very broad perspective in post memory studies about the dictatorship because of this transmission of ideas through words. Could you give us some examples of the relationship between language and this post memory of the dictatorship in Brazil?
Yeah, so language would be the main way to transmit these memories, these traumatic memories, right? In any place, not only in Brazil. The problem was that in Brazil, the government, the in the aftermath of the dictatorship, the governments that took power after it were not very interested in finding out what really happened during the dictatorship, and even less um, in doing any kind of memory work for
Mm-hmm.
preserving the memories of the traumatic experiences of the dictatorship. So that's why we forgot. I was born 1 year before the military coup in 1964. So I was born in 1963. And I lived my whole school life almost during the dictatorship. But at my time, it was called a revolution. So since then, we see that the government did not assume its role as a dictatorship, as an autocratic government, right? So even after the military government, we had a commission of truth commission, but there was no reconciliation as they have in Canada, for example,
Mm-hmm.
the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Here it was nothing. They simply forgave the not only the victims, but the revolutionaries that were trying to rebel against the government, but also the perpetrators, the torturers, uh, those who killed people for no reason at all. Yeah, so nothing happened in Brazil that would preserve these memories. What we can find a little bit, as you said, is in arts,
Mm-hmm.
in literature, in some works of art as paintings, sculptures, monuments also, like in Rio, I guess. Now I don't know, I don't remember where exactly, but there are a few monuments in honor of those who died during the dictatorship. Also, a few monuments in honor of those who died during the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to the military government in Brazil, one part like that is also I consider art is music. So we had during the dictatorship lots of songwriters and musicians who would write songs against the military government and talking about how the government was trying to silence and torturing the population, even the civil population. But these lyrics that were written at this time had to be disguised in certain way that the military government would not recognize them
Mm-hmm.
as songs against the government. Otherwise, they would be censored
Yeah.
and prohibited in the country. And that happened to many songs at that
That
time,
there's
right?
a very nice song. I don't remember if the name is Cálice, but I remember the part
Mm-hmm.
of the song.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. By what's his name?
Oh, I don't remember.
Forgot.
Sorry. I can
Ah,
search it, but I
no,
don't
I
remember.
remember, but it just skipped my mind right now. But yeah, so many of these songwriters and singers had to leave Brazil, otherwise they would be killed
Mm-hmm.
or in jailed for a long time, tortured and things like that. Elis Regina, for example, we had a documentary on her life some time ago. Yeah, like 2 years ago, I guess. So very recent. And there was a part. She was in Europe, I think, and participating in an interview, and she said that. Because one, I don't remember the question itself, but her answer was that the military were monkeys. Uh, the army, the soldiers, that they were monkeys. So of course the government watched, so somebody watched the interview, and when she was back in Brazil, she was caught, not really imprisoned, but they she understood that they knew everything about her life. They knew where her kids were, their schools. So she was afraid um, of
Mm-hmm.
losing her kids, and she made an agreement with the government that she would sing to the soldiers in a certain. So she went to a big concert promoted by the government, and she sang to the soldiers as a way of asking for forgiveness
Mm-hmm.
and not having her kids
Tortured as
uh,
well, yeah.
tortured or kidnapped, something like that. So that's how she, and of course, then she stopped talking about or against the military
Mm-hmm.
government. But one of the songs that she recorded, O Bêbado e a Equilibrista, talks about how during the military government, people had to walk on a tightrope.
Mm-hmm.
That's the idea of the equilibrista, right?
Mm-hmm.
Walking on a tightrope. Uh, so you couldn't fail. You had to. Sorry, you couldn't fall. You had to try to balance your way on a tightrope so
Mm-hmm.
that you wouldn't be caught by
Yeah.
the military government, right? And other things. Um, the song is very interesting, but again,
Mm-hmm.
the whole lyrics is disguised in a way that the government doesn't understand.
Yes.
So yeah, so even for us to understand the lyrics, you have to know about what was going on at that period,
You need
right?
to be critical, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, and we have to research. We have to know about the history of that specific period in Brazil. So not people sing the song and just think it's a beautiful song, or but it is a very critical song.
mhm. So to recap everything we discussed, you explained to us what is applied linguistics, and we gave examples of how can you, as a teacher, a language teacher specifically, be critical about what happened in the past to in order to not forget. And we gave the
Right.
examples
And avoid repeating,
and avoid
right? So
repeating.
if you don't forget, you won't want this
Mm-hmm.
problem, that's a trauma, to be repeated. But if
Mm-hmm.
you forget, then you forget. You don't know, right?
So that's the importance of the applied linguistics. You would
That's
say.
I'd say that's the importance of post memory
Mm-hmm.
in applied
Oh yeah.
linguistics.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So to finish, would you like to recommend some authors the students could look like if someone gets interested about applying linguistics? Could you recommend some authors? Can be both in English and Portuguese because maybe.
Well, in English, I would certainly recommend Alistair Pennycook, who speaks basically, at least nowadays, about critical applied linguistics and why applied linguistics should continue to be critical.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Kanagaraja, his first name is Shurish. Kanagaraja, he is from Sri Lanka. uh, of course, now he teaches and research in the U.S. But he is the one who talks about this idea of world languages and multilingualism and why we don't need to be native like,
Mm-hmm.
why the native speaker has lost importance in learning a language. Who else? In Brazil, I would recommend Lin Mario Menezes de Souza and Valkyria Montemor, who are the two researchers at USP, University of São Paulo, who brought this idea of critical language teaching to Brazil back in 2006, but also before that, in 2006, they published an official document suggesting critical perspectives in language teaching. And that's when we really started doing this critical work in Brazil. So I would recommend the two of them. Also, Professor Clarissa Jordão in Universidade Federal do Paraná, Federal University of Paraná. She is now retired, but she has lots of text in English
Oh, that's good.
on critical language teaching. Yeah, myself, if I
Okay, for
may.
sure. For sure.
Yeah, well, we have a big group called National Project,
Mm-hmm.
involving more than 20 federal universities, a few state universities, and even some private universities, with researchers in most of the states in Brazil, not all, but in many of them, focusing only on critical language teaching and critical language teacher education. So some of us do publish in English. So if anybody is interested, there is also Rosane Rocha Pessoa, from Universidade Federal de Goiás, Goiás Federal University. Yeah, several people. This is the velha guarda, let's say,
Okay.
old, the old ones, but there are younger researchers as well that are publishing in critical language studies. Yeah, well, all around the world, let's say, besides Pennycook and Kanagaraja, there is also Professor Kumaravajvelu, who is mostly focused on language teaching
Mm-hmm.
itself. So Pennycook and Kanagaraja would be more at the level of applied linguistics in general, but Kumaravajvelu is very much focused on language teaching and language teacher education, also from a critical perspective. There are many others, in fact. Claire Crumch, who has been the um, director of the International Organization of Applied Linguistics. Yeah, many other researchers that have been talking about
Mm-hmm.
critical language issues. So we see that it is really the main focus of research and practice in applied linguistics nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, critical language studies and critical language teaching. In my view, there is no other better perspective. in terms of language teaching and teacher education, then a critical perspective, which will also involve a decolonial perspective. And in this sense, you might be better prepared to talk about it than me. But I would say that this decolonial perspective that we now have comes from a critical
For
perspective in
sure.
language and language teaching. We can't have a decolonial view of language and language
Of
teaching and
course.
learning if we are not critical about it, right? If we don't have a critical perspective. Um, yeah, so there are several possibilities, I'd say, of opening up new areas in applied linguistics
Hmm.
through these critical and decolonial perspectives. And uh, the alternative is the traditional, more difficult, more tiresome,
Detached
more
to the reality.
detached from social use, the social uses of language. Yeah, a harder path, I would
Hmm.
say,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
That's why I call
It's,
it hard linguistic.
yeah, yeah, you're right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So thank you
for
for your
sure.
time. And would you like to add anything else?
Well, I would just like to thank you for your interest in my work and also for giving me this opportunity to talk about my
My pleasure.
studies, my my views. Thank you very much.